we're going to pick up then in Jonah chapter 1 and verse 3. So if you turn to Jonah 1 and verse 3, we read there, "But Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and went down to Joppa. And he found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare thereof, and went down into it to go with them into Tarshish from the presence of the Lord." So there's a lot in verse 3. There's a lot that we need to talk about here in verse 3. The first thing at the beginning of the verse there, that expression rose up. The Hebrew word for rose up is the same as the Hebrew word for arise in verse 2. So in verse 2, we get God's command. I want you to get up. He says there's a sense of urgency to this. The word flee there in verse 3 indicates a sense of urgency. He bolted. He fled suddenly. God says, I want you to arise and go to Nineveh. And what does Jonah do? He does exactly the opposite, right? Instead of going to Nineveh, he goes in exactly the opposite direction, and he flees into Tarshish. And he does it immediately. There is no hesitation. He does it with haste. He goes in the opposite direction, and he takes deliberate steps to avoid preaching to Nineveh. And so Jonah chooses here in verse 3 to neglect his duty. He chooses to go in the opposite direction. He chooses to do something different than what God wanted him to do. And we have some examples in Scripture of individuals who didn't want to do what God wanted them to do. We're not going to look it up just in the interest of time, but in Exodus chapter 4, you remember Moses, who tried to refuse God's appointment. You remember Ezekiel was not happy about his mission in Ezekiel chapter 3. There were others like Jonah who tried to avoid their mission that God had given them. But the passage that I'd like to turn to is in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, because I think perhaps there is an allusion here to Jonah in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Here in 1 Corinthians 9, we have the stewardship, if you will, of the Apostle Paul. And he says there in verse 16 of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and now keep Jonah in the back of your mind as you go through this and we read this. He says in verse 16, "For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel." Now think of the mind of Jonah. Jonah had the opposite, didn't he, of verse 16. Woe unto me if I preach not the gospel. Jonah didn't want to preach the gospel. And so he says in verse 17, Paul says, "For if I do this thing willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will," which is how Jonah did it, right? He did it against his will, "a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me." That word necessity in that verse means stewardship. A stewardship is committed unto me. And it's translated that way in a number of different versions. And so what was Jonah thinking? He had a stewardship just like the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul says here in 1 Corinthians, he says, I can do it willingly or unwillingly, but it's going to happen. And there's consequences to doing it one way or the other. So what was Jonah thinking? How could he do that? How could he go and arise and go in exactly the opposite direction to what God wanted him to do? We might think to ourselves, well, can't relate to Jonah. I would never do that. We all have a service. We all have a ministry. We all have a stewardship. We all have a spiritual obligation. But how do we react when a situation arises in the ecclesia that maybe we're not comfortable with? A decision is made maybe that we disagree with. How do we react? Have we ever gone into a spiritual pout? Chosen to neglect our role? Perhaps chosen even to work against whatever it is that is going on so that it doesn't happen or that it doesn't work out. Perhaps we've chosen to absent ourselves from the ecclesia for a period of time. That's the mindset of Jonah. That's our natural inclination, right? If things don't go our way, we'll find then, I'm going to put on a spiritual pout and I'm just going to be obstinate, right? That's Jonah. We've got to be different than Jonah. That's part of the exhortation of the prophecy of Jonah, is that we need to be different. We need to have a different mindset, not following our natural inclinations to flee and go in the opposite direction when things don't necessarily go the way we think they should or the way we would like them to go. And so when we come back to Jonah chapter 1 and verse 3, Jonah rose up to flee. What was he fleeing from? At the end of the verse, and we're going to look at a number of things in this verse, but just jump to the end of the verse now. It says he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. He was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. Well, what does that mean? You think of Jonah as a prophet. Certainly Jonah must have known, he must have understood that there is no way that you can flee from the presence of the Lord, because God is omnipresent. He's everywhere present. He knows where we are at any given point in time, and he knows our circumstances. So what is it that Jonah is talking about when it says in verse 3, or what does it mean in verse 3 that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord? Now, some commentators suggest that and Christadelphian commentators as well, suggest that he is fleeing from the land of Israel. He's fleeing to get out of the land of Israel and the place where the temple was, because that's where God dwelt amongst his people. And that is a possibility. But I don't necessarily think that that's why Jonah was fleeing. I'd like to suggest something different. So the word presence there in the Hebrew, it means face. He was fleeing from the face of God, and it's the same word as before in verse 2. So when the sins of Nineveh, it says in verse 2, came up before God, it's the same word, right? It's the same word that's used there in verse 2. The same word is used in Genesis 3 verse 8 with Adam and Eve, right? When they were in the garden and they tried to hide themselves from the presence of God. And in Genesis chapter 4 verse 16, Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, right? So I'm going to suggest to you that there's a different meaning than what some of those commentators suggest, that he was simply trying to get out of the nation of God and the place where God dwelt, that being the temple. Pusey, and I mentioned to you last week, I didn't bring it this week, but this is what he says, and I tend to agree with them, and we'll look at John 6 in a moment. I think it provides perhaps some insight into the mindset of Jonah here. Jonah, as God's prophet, knew full well that no man can escape from the presence of God. He knew full well the words of David, "Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence?" We looked up that passage in Psalm, I think it was 136 or 134 last week. Jonah fled not from God's presence, but from standing before him as his servant and minister. He renounced his office. So I would suggest to you that that's what it means when it says that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. He was trying to get away from his obligation. He was fleeing from his duty. He was trying to get away from his stewardship. He was renouncing his office as a prophet. And he was trying to resign, if you will, before God from being the prophet of Israel. Now let's turn over to John chapter 6. In John chapter 6, keep Jonah in the back of your mind here, but in John chapter 6, I would suggest to you that we get the mindset or the thinking of Jonah here. John chapter 6. And here we have in John chapter 6 the master teaching his disciples and those that were following him primarily about the atonement and how it was supposed to work, and talking about his death here. And look at what it says there, first of all, in verse 60. We're not going to read all the context, but in verse 60 it says, "Many therefore of his disciples, when they had heard this, said, "This is an hard saying, who can hear it?" Now think of Jonah, right? Going and preaching to Nineveh. That was a hard saying for Jonah. That was something that Jonah couldn't comprehend, that Jonah didn't want to hear because he was worried the Ninevites were going to repent and God was going to turn his back on the people of Israel. So that was a hard saying for Jonah, right? Just like it was for the apostles here, the teaching of the Master. And so what happens here in John chapter 6? If you look at verse 64, but there are some of you that believe not, for Jesus knew from the beginning who they were that believed not and who should betray him. And so just skip down to verse 66. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. So I would suggest to you that that's the mindset of Jonah, right? He was dealing with a hard saying, something that he couldn't understand, something that he didn't want to understand. And so he chose to go the other way. He chose to walk away and go no more with God, if you will, like they did here, the disciples did in John chapter 6. So I would suggest to you that that's really what he's talking about, is that he's walking away and he's choosing to walk no more with God. He's renouncing his office as a prophet, and he's trying to go and hide in the wilderness, like the meaning of his name being a dove. So come back to Jonah chapter 1 and verse 3. It says there that Jonah went down. It uses that expression twice in Jonah chapter 1 and verse 3. Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa. He found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare thereof, and he went down into the belly of the ship. And so there's this repeated expression about him going down. And I would like to suggest to you that there's perhaps an allusion to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Turn, if you will, to Luke chapter 10. If you come to Luke chapter 10, you'll remember that the traveler who was going from Jericho to Jerusalem was, or from Jerusalem to Jericho, was going down, right, from a higher elevation to another. Jesus answering said, verse 30 of Luke chapter 10, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So the priest passed by on the other side, right? The priest represents here the ceremony of the law. And then who comes next? A Levite. The Levite representing the legalism of the law. The Levite comes in verse 32. A Levite, when he was at this place, came and looked on him, and he passed by on the other side. But there was a certain Samaritan in verse 33, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him. So I would suggest to you that Jonah was being like the priest, and he was being like the Levite, as this certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And he needed to be more like the Samaritan. Because look at the question that gets asked at the end of this parable. He says in verse 36, he says, which now of these three thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves? And what was the answer in verse 37? He that showed mercy on him. And so what does God say? Or what is said in the parable here? What does Jesus say? Go and do thou likewise. Right? That's the message that Jonah needed to get. He needed to be more like the Samaritan. He needed to be like the one that showed mercy. And he needed to go and do likewise like this Samaritan did in this parable. So I'd like you to turn to Psalm 107. Psalm 107, we didn't go there last week, but Psalm 107, I think, is a pertinent passage to the prophecy of Jonah with respect to the mariners that were operating the ship. It says that Jonah went down. Well, look at what it says. It uses that same expression about the mariners in Psalm 107. Now put yourselves take yourselves out of Jonah's shoes and put yourself now in the mariner's shoes as we read Psalm 107, beginning at verse 23. They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, they see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. So there's 4 individuals that are praying here in Psalm 107. There's the redeemed that are praying in verse 2. There's the rebellious that are praying in verse 11. There's the foolish that are praying in verse 17. And now it's the merchants that are praying in verse 23 and on. And each one of the stanzas is separated by a repeated phrase in this psalm. The repeated phrase is in verse 6. Then they cried unto the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them out of their distresses. And then again in verse 8, oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. That same expression that is used for the redeemed praying in verse 2 is used in verses 13 and 15 for the rebellious that are praying in verse 11, and for the foolish that are praying in verse 17, in verses 19 and 21. And now we're reading about the mariners, and those same expressions are going to be repeated for the mariners. And the mariners here represent the merchants. They represent the business, the economy of the day, right? Because that's how trading was done. It was done by sea. So let's pick up then. They that go down to the sea in ships, verse 23, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth up the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heaven. They go down again to the depths. Their soul is melted because of trouble. So notice the expression, they go down, they go down, they go down. They reel to and fro, they stagger like a drunken man. They are at their wits' end. Now, if you have a margin there, what does it say in your margin for at their wits' end? All their wisdom is swallowed up. All their wisdom is swallowed up. And that's exactly what happened with the mariners in Jonah, right? All their wisdom became swallowed up so that they no more served their gods, right? Or feared their gods. They feared the God of heaven by the end of the chapter. Then they cry unto the Lord in their trouble, and he bringeth them out of their distresses. He maketh the storm a calm, so that the waves thereof are still. Then are they glad, because they be quiet, so he bringeth them into their desired haven. And here's the repetitive phrases. Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. And so the mariners went down also, and we see that expression used there in Psalm 107, and the obvious allusions to the mariners and their situation in the storm on the sea in Jonah chapter 1. Turn, if you will, to Isaiah chapter 42. Isaiah chapter 42 talks about the mariners singing a new song. Isaiah chapter 42. Isaiah 42, verse 10. Verse 9, behold, the former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. Sing unto the Lord a new song, and his praise from the end of the earth. Ye that go down, there's our expression, go down to the sea, and all that is therein, the isles and the inhabitants thereof. So this is obviously a future prophecy. This is a future prophecy, but it says that even those who go down into the sea will sing a new song. They'll sing unto the Lord. And what happens? Come back to Jonah chapter 1. In Jonah chapter 1, what happens at the end of that chapter? And we're going to look at this in a moment. But if you come back to Jonah chapter 1, I got to find Jonah again. I have a hard time finding Jonah. There it is. Jonah chapter 1 at the end. If you look at verse 16, here's the new song, right? From verse 1 down to verse 16, they've done an about face so that by the time verse 16 rolls around, it says, "Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and offered a sacrifice unto the Lord, and made vows." That's the new song, right? And so we come back to verse 3. Jonah goes down to Joppa, he goes down into the ship, and then together with the merchants, they all go down into the sea. So in Jonah chapter 1 and verse 3, I think we're going to skip this next slide, but he goes down to the city Joppa. Now, why would he pick Joppa? Like, what's special about Joppa? Why in particular would he pick Joppa? Well, there's two things that I'd like to suggest here. One is the name of Joppa. It means in the Hebrew, the word Joppa means to be fair. It means to be fair. So the city that Jonah chooses to get into the ship at, and it may have been convenient because Joppa may have been a significant port at that particular point in time of the history of Israel. But Joppa means to be fair. Well, you think about Jonah in his situation, what God wanted him to do. Jonah's thinking was that it absolutely wasn't fair that he should go to Nineveh and preach to them because they may have repented to the neglect of his own people. That's how Jonah viewed it. And so he didn't think it was fair. And, it reminds me of a parable. Turn, if you will, to Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20 talks about the laborers in the vineyard. And I think the lesson that the master is teaching here is the lesson that Jonah needed to learn. In Matthew chapter 20, remember all the laborers. The kingdom of heaven, verse 1, is likened unto a man that is an householder, which went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. And so he goes and he hires laborers. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And then a few hours later, in the third hour, in verse 3, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said unto them, "Go also into the vineyards, and whatsoever is right," he says, "I will give you." Whatsoever is right, I will give you. Well, he's already hired some laborers that started, say, at the break of dawn. And then 3 hours later, he hires more, and he tells them, "Whatsoever is right, I will give you." And so they go their way. Again, he goes out about the sixth hour, the ninth hour, and does likewise. And he says, "Whatsoever is right, I will give you. Whatsoever is right, I will give you." They say unto him in verse 7, "Because no man hath hired us, he saith unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and again, whatsoever is right, that shall ye receive." So when even was come in verse 8, the Lord of the vineyard said unto the steward, "Call the laborers and give them their hire, beginning from the last unto the first." And when they came that were hired about the 11th hour, they received a penny. But when the first came, they supposed that he should have received more. And they likewise received every man a penny. And when they had received it, they murmured against the good man of the house, saying, "These last have wrought but 1 hour, and thou hast made them equal unto us, which have borne the burden and heat of the day." But he answered one of them and said, "Friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst thou not agree with me for a penny? Take that thine is, and go thy way. I will give unto this last, even as unto thee." So, from a natural humanistic thinking, you would agree with the laborers, right? The laborer that worked for, 10 or 12 hours in the day versus the laborer that only worked 1 hour should have received much more. That would make sense, but that's not how it works with God, is it? He's obviously not talking about money necessarily here. Now, here's the crux of the matter. Verse 15, and this is the lesson that Jonah needed to learn about how God operates and the fairness of God. Verse 15, "Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with mine own?" Now, here's the lesson that Jonah needed to learn at the end of verse 15. "Is thine eye evil because I am good?" Is thine eye evil because I am good? Jonah certainly had an evil eye, so to speak, didn't he, relative to the city of Nineveh. But God is a God of mercy. And Jonah needed to understand that. Is thine eye evil because I am good? I'd like to suggest keep your finger in the New Testament there, because we're going to go to Acts in a moment. But I'd also like to suggest that, perhaps there's another reason why Joppa was chosen, and there perhaps is here an allusion to the work of Peter. And there's a comparison here. I have it up here on the chart. Jonah, we know he was commissioned to bring the word to the Ninevites, the Gentiles, if you will, in Jonah chapter 1, verse 2. And when we think of Peter, Peter was known as the son of Jonah in John 21 and verse 15. And he received the keys to the kingdom for both Jew and Gentile in Matthew 16. So perhaps a little bit of a parallel there. We know that Jonah fled to Joppa to escape God's command. Well, turn, if you will, to Acts chapter 10. I'd suggest to you that it may be significant that Peter also in Joppa had a change of mind, because we know that Peter at first resisted, just like Jonah did, about going to preach to the Gentiles, and it's at Joppa that he receives the dream that caused him to change his mind. Acts chapter 10 and verse 5, now send men to Joppa and call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter. And again in verse 8, and when he had declared all things unto them, he sent them to Joppa. And so Peter was in Joppa. They all go to Joppa. And what happens in Joppa before they arrive? Verse 9, on the morrow as they went on their journey and drew nigh unto the city, Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. And we know the dream that he had, right? It was about preaching to the Gentiles, those whom Peter understood to be unclean. And Peter had to learn that there is nothing that is common or unclean relative to the gospel message. And even after Peter received the dream, look at what his reaction was in verse 17. Now, while Peter doubted in himself, so he still wasn't 100% convinced, was he? He doubted in himself. And in verse 20, he's commanded, arise, therefore, get thee down and go with them, and doubt nothing, for I have sent them. And we know what happens. He preaches the truth to Cornelius and his family. And by the end of the chapter, we have the first Gentile converts in the New Testament in Acts chapter 10 at the end of the chapter. And so I think there's some parallels here between Jonah and between Peter. Jonah needed to learn that the Gentiles could also be recipients of God's grace. And Peter was taught the same lesson in a dream in Acts chapter 10. And so he tells what he learned in verse 28. He said unto them, ye know that it is unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come into one of another nation. But God hath showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean. That's again the message that Jonah needed to learn that Peter understood from his dream. And we know that the Ninevites repented finally in Jonah chapter 3, and Cornelius and his household was baptized in Acts chapter 10. So I'd suggest to you that Joppa is significant there in verse 3 for those reasons. And I think that there's a parallel here. We have Jonah as the prophet to the Gentiles and Peter as the apostle to the Gentiles in Acts chapter 10. So those are the thoughts on verse 3, and it's 9 minutes after 10. And we've covered one verse, so we want to cover a little bit more than we covered last week. So let's see if we can get past verse 4. So turn, if you will, to Jonah chapter 1 and verse 4. Jonah 1 and verse 4, he flees, he goes into Tarshish. He's trying to get away from his duty as a prophet before God. And so when he gets in the ship and they leave the dock, what happens in verse 4? The Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken. The ship was like to be broken. We see how God works here in the life of Jonah. A great wind means a twisting or circling wind, so it's probably like a cyclone, a hurricane, or what we would call today maybe a tornado. And God uses the elements, doesn't he, to his advantage. And we're we're not going to look up all those passages. We're probably familiar with them, but Psalm 135, he bringeth the wind out of his treasuries. It's like God has a little toolbox, right? And in his toolbox, one of them is the wind. And he says, the wind is what I need to use here with Jonah. I'm going to bring the wind out. I'm going to bring the wind upon the waters, and we're going to turn Jonah around. The stormy wind fulfilling his word in Psalm 148 and verse 8. And in Psalm 48 verse 7, thou breakest the ships of Tarshish with an east wind. So this was a common thing that was known amongst the people, that on the journey to Tarshish, there were winds that came up, and God uses them to his advantage here in working with Jonah. Now, I want to turn, if you will, to 1 Kings chapter 22. 1 Kings chapter 22, we read about one of the kings of Israel here and how God worked in a storm in his life. Jehoshaphat in verse 48. It says, Jehoshaphat made ships of Tarshish to go to Ophir for gold, but they went not, for the ships were broken at Ezion-Geber. So he made all these ships. They were going to go to Tarshish to do some trading and pick up some merchandise, but the ships were broken at Ezion-Geber. Then said Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, unto Jehoshaphat, let my servants go with thy servants in the ships, but Jehoshaphat would not. So it seems that the ships were first broken in verse 48, and then another opportunity comes, and Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, says to Jehoshaphat, you know what, let's try this again. Let's see if we can jump in the ships and go do some trading and some merchandise in Ezion-Geber. And keep your finger there and turn, if you will, over to 2 Chronicles chapter 20. 2 Chronicles chapter 20 gives us a little bit of background information to what happened between those two verses in 2 Kings. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, and we're going to read at verse 35. After this, did Jehoshaphat king of Judah join himself with Ahaziah king of Israel, who did very wickedly. And he joined himself with him to make ships to go to Tarshish. And they made the ships in Ezion-Geber. Then Eliezer, the son of Dodavah of Mareshah, prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, because thou hast joined thyself with Ahaziah, the Lord hath broken thy works, and the ships were broken, that they were not able to go to Tarshish. So that is what happened. If you come back to 2 Kings chapter 22, that's what happened in verse 48, right? There was an alliance made that was evil before God, and so God intervened and he broke the ships so that they couldn't go. And so when he's approached again in verse 49, it says, then said Ahaziah the son of Ahab unto Jehoshaphat, let my servants go with thy servants in the ships, but Jehoshaphat refused. Why did he refuse? Because he had learned the lesson of the storm that God brought that destroyed the ships that were going to Tarshish to pick up merchandise. He learned his lesson the first time, and Jehoshaphat deliberately chose not to commit the same offense the second. And so that's how God works, isn't it? That was the purpose of the storm in Jonah chapter 1. Jonah needed to be like Jehoshaphat and learn the lesson of the storm. And that's how God works with us. He works with us in bringing storms into our life, just like he did with Jehoshaphat and how Jehoshaphat responded. And we need to respond to the storms in our life, just like Jehoshaphat did in Kings and in Chronicles. But that's how God works. Turn, if you will, to Psalm 77. Psalm 77 is one of my favorite passages in Scripture. Look at what it says about the storms in our life. Psalm 77, beginning at verse 13, thy way, O God, is in the sanctuary. Who is so great a God as our God? Thou art the God that doest wonders. Thou hast declared thy strength among the people. Thou hast with thine arm redeemed thy people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw thee, O God, the waters saw thee. They were afraid, the depths also were troubled. The clouds poured out water, the skies sent out a sound. Thine arrows also went abroad. The voice of thy thunder was in the heaven. The lightnings lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. That's like the storm that Jonah was in Jonah chapter 1, wasn't it? Verse 19, thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps are not known. So that's what happens in the storms of life, isn't it? And we all will have those storms, whether it be a health condition, whether it be an accident, whether it be a loss of a job, whatever, our storm in life might be. Those storms have been put there for a purpose. There's a lesson to be learned in every storm that we experience in life. Because in those storms of life, although we may not visibly see the hand of God, we need to understand and we need to know that He is there. Although His footsteps may not be known. And when we go through the storms of life, turn if you will to Isaiah chapter 30. When we go through the storms of life, we need to stop and listen for the lesson that God is trying to teach us. Because there's two events in our life, isn't there? There's two events in the life of a believer. There's those events that God causes to happen, and those events in our life that God allows to happen. The events that God causes and the events that God allows. But He is aware of all of those events in the life of a believer. And so when we go through those events in life, what does Isaiah chapter 30 tell us that we need to do? Isaiah chapter 30, we'll begin to read at verse 18. And therefore will the Lord wait, that He may be gracious unto you, and therefore will He be exalted, that He may have mercy upon you. For the Lord is a God of judgment. Blessed are all they that wait for Him. For the people shall dwell in Zion at Jerusalem. Thou shalt weep no more. He will be very gracious unto thee at the voice of thy cry. When He shall hear it, He will answer thee. And though the Lord give you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, or if you look at your margin, the water of oppression, right? And that's the water that Jonah was experiencing in Jonah chapter 1. Whether He give you the bread of adversity or the water of oppression, yet shall not thy teachers be removed into a corner any more, but thine eyes shall see thy teachers, and thine ears shall hear a word behind thee, saying, this is the way, walk ye in it. In all the storms of life, there's a lesson to be learned, and we need to stop and recognize that God is there, and we need to figure out the way that God is asking us to walk. Listen to that still small voice when the storm is over, and ask ourselves, what did we learn from what we experienced in the storms of our life? Come back to Jonah chapter 1 and verse 4. It says in Jonah chapter 1 and verse 4, at the end of that verse, that the ship was like to be broken. The Hebrew for broken means to burst or to break apart. And we know that the ships were made of wood at that particular point in history. They were made from wood. And so the ships would have been in a fierce storm, and especially a storm that was brought about by God here in Jonah chapter 1. They would have put so much pressure on the structure of the ship that the ship was in danger of breaking apart and bursting asunder. Now, turn, if you will, to Acts chapter 27. In Acts chapter 27, we have the storm that, another storm that appeared or that occurred out on the water as Paul was traveling. In Acts chapter 27, look at what it says in Acts chapter 27 and verse 17. It says, when they had taken up and used helps. So the situation here, without going into all the details, because we're running out of time, without going into all the details, the situation was desperate, wasn't it? They were in a storm just like Jonah and the mariners were in Jonah chapter 1. And so their ship was about to be broken up as well. And so in verse 17 it says, when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into quicksands, they strake sail, and so were driven. And so the ship was about to be broken apart, and so they used these, what is called here in verse 17, they used helps. And helps, if you look at the Greek, oh, sorry, I didn't change the slide, my bad. If you look at the Greek, the word helps means a rope or chain for frapping a vessel. And so when I read that, I was like, well, that doesn't really help me. I didn't really know what helps were, and now I don't know what frapping is. But when I looked it up, what frapping is, when the vessels, the ships in that day, when they got into a storm, they would have all these ropes along the side of the ship. They were either ropes or chains along the side of the ship. And they would get one sailor on each side of the ship, and they would grab one side of the rope and another side of the rope, and they'd go to the bow of the ship or to the stern of the ship, and they'd put the rope over the front, and then they'd walk it along. And then when they got to the point that they wanted to tie it together, they'd tie it together, and they would have a come along to bring it tight. And they would do that all along the length of the ship. And that's how they would hold the ships together. And I'm sure that happened in Jonah chapter 1 as well. When it was about to be broken, they would have frapped the ship, and they would have put those ropes or chains across the ship to try and hold it together. Well, sometimes in the storms of our life, we need to frap our ship as well. The Greek word for helps is only used one other time in Scripture. And it's in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16 says, let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain helps. The word is translated in the King James as mercy, but in the Greek it's the same word, that we may obtain mercy and find, it's not mercy, it's grace, and find grace to help in time of need. So there's our word help, and it's grace and it's mercy that is our help in our time of need. It's grace and mercy that fraps our ship when we're going through the storms of life. Sometimes the storms of life will bring us to our knees. And when they bring us to our knees, that's when we come, in verse 16, boldly unto the throne of grace. And it's only through the mercy and grace of God that we learn the lessons of the storms of life and move forward in a positive spiritual direction.